Learn English through story. The Shadowed Lover. The city of Valmorn was a place where shadows clung to the edges of cobbled streets, where candlelight flickered in high windows, and where secrets nestled in the folds of velvet curtains. It was a city of wealth and ruin, where love and betrayal wove together like the intricate patterns of the embroidered tapestries that lined its grandest halls. In the heart of Valmorn, a man walked alone. His name was Cashin Dane, a figure of whispered legends and half-told truths. Some said he was a noble who had abandoned his title for the love of a woman. Others claimed he was a merchant whose fortune had been stolen by treacherous hands. But the truth, like most things in Valmorn, was far more complicated. Cashin had once loved, and he had once lost. Now, he lived in the in-between. A man neither wholly present nor entirely absent, a ghost of his own making. By day, he was unseen, a figure who moved unnoticed through the city's crowded markets and quiet alleyways. By night, he became something else, an apparition of longing, a shadowed lover who existed only in the periphery of those who had once known him. It was on a night of quiet rain that he saw her again. Elise Laurent, the woman who had shattered him. She stood beneath the golden glow of a street lantern, her dark hair pinned in careful braids, her gown a deep crimson that reminded him of the last time they had spoken. She did not see him, or perhaps she did, and chose to ignore the spectre that lurked at the edge of her vision. Cashin had not expected to feel anything when he saw her again. He had told himself he was beyond grief, beyond the aching hunger of what had been stolen from him. But standing there in the rain, watching her turn and step into the warm embrace of another man, he felt something stir within him, a slow-burning ember that had never truly died. Valmorn was a city where people wore masks, where the past could be rewritten, and where vengeance could be as sweet as love itself. And as Cashin turned away, the shadows embracing him once more, he knew that his story was far from over. Cashin had always believed that love, once lost, could never return in its true form. He had spent years convincing himself of this, letting bitterness fill the void where affection had once lived. But seeing Elise again was like reopening an old wound, one that had never truly healed. He walked the rain-slicked streets of Valmorn, the city's night air thick with the scent of damp stone and distant firewood. His boots made no sound against the cobblestones, a skill he had acquired through necessity rather than design. Once he had walked these streets as a man of promise, a man who had everything to lose. Now, he walked them as a shadow, a whisper of the past that refused to be silenced. Elise had moved on. Cashin had always known she would, but it was the sight of her with another man that unsettled him. The way she leaned into the stranger's touch, the soft smile she gave him, the same smile she had once reserved for Cashin alone. He had not prepared himself for that. He found himself at the threshold of a place he had vowed never to return to, a quiet tavern, nestled between two towering buildings, its entrance marked by an iron lantern swaying gently in the wind. The Silver Veil was a place of quiet meetings and unspoken transactions, a haven for those who wished to remain unseen. Cashin had spent many nights here, nursing his wounds in solitude, watching the world move on without him. Inside, the tavern was dimly lit, its wooden beams heavy with age. The scent of spiced wine and burning tallow filled the air. A few patrons occupied the tables, speaking in hushed voices, their faces obscured by the flickering glow of candlelight. Cashin made his way to the bar, his presence acknowledged only by the barkeeper, stout man with a scar running from his brow to his jaw. "Back from the dead, are you?" the man murmured, pouring a dark amber liquid into a glass and sliding it across the counter. Cashin smirked, though the expression lacked humor. "Something like that." The barkeep nodded, as if he understood, though Cashin doubted anyone truly did. He took a slow sip of the liquor, letting its warmth spread through him. He had no plan, no clear path forward. Only the lingering image of Elise, the weight of old wounds, and the knowledge that some ghosts refuse to stay buried. As he sat in silence, a presence settled beside him. A woman, her hood drawn low, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's being watched," she said, her tone laced with quiet urgency. Cassian's grip tightened around the glass. "By whom?" The woman hesitated before answering. "By those who remember what she did." A slow pulse of unease spread through him. Cassian had spent years drowning in his own heartbreak, in the betrayal that had torn his life apart. That now, for the first time in a long while, a different thought took root in his mind. Elise was not just a woman who had left him. She was a woman in danger, and no matter how much he had tried to erase her from his heart, he could not ignore the one undeniable truth that remained. He still loved her. The weight of the woman's words settled over Cassian like a slow-forming storm. "She's being watched by those who remember what she did." He turned slightly, his gaze shifting toward the hooded stranger who had delivered the warning. The dim light of the silver veil cast her features in half shadow, but he could make out the sharp angles of her cheekbones and the dark glint of her eyes beneath the hood's edge. "You should walk away from this," she murmured, voice barely above the hum of conversation around them. "If you're wise, you'll let the past stay buried." Cassian exhaled slowly, setting his glass down with measured control. "I find that difficult," he said, "since it seems the past refuses to let me go." The woman's lips twitched in something that might have been amusement or pity. "Some things are meant to be forgotten, Cassian Dane, but if you insist on chasing ghosts, then you should know the dangers you invite." She rose from her seat before he could press her further, disappearing into the crowded tavern like mist vanishing beneath the morning sun. Cassian sat in silence for a long moment, fingers drumming absently against the rim of his glass. He had spent years trying to bury Elise beneath the weight of his own bitterness, but hearing that she was being watched, that someone still held grievances against her, grievances worth acting upon, unsettled something deep within him. For years, he had told himself he hated her, that what she had done was unforgivable, that hate and love were not as different as people liked to believe. He left the silver veil without another word, stepping into the damp chill of the night. The rain had eased to a fine mist, curling around the lamplights in hazy halos. Valmorn did not sleep. Its streets were alive even at this late hour, filled with merchants closing their stalls, beggars seeking shelter beneath awnings, and masked figures moving through the darkness with quiet purpose. Cassian pulled the hood of his cloak higher and melted into the crowd. He had no right to go to her, and yet he found himself tracing the familiar path to Elise's home. The house was as he remembered it, tall and stately, nestled within the wealthier quarter of the city. Its facade was pristine, the windows dark except for a single flickering light on the upper floor. He had stood in this very place once before, long ago, on a night that had changed everything, a night when he had believed in forever. Now, he stood in the shadows, watching, and then movement, a figure slipping through the garden. barely more than a silhouette against the darkness. Swift, intentional, not a passing stranger. Cashin felt his body tense, instinct taking hold before thought. He moved before he could stop himself, crossing the street in silence, slipping through the gate with the ease of a man who had spent many years navigating the unseen corners of the world. The figure reached the side of the house, pausing beneath the second-floor window, the same window where Elise's light still burned. Cashin caught the glint of metal in their hand. A knife. Something inside him twisted violently. He should have let her go, should have stayed in the safety of his own solitude. But instead he stepped forward, the shadows embracing him like an old friend. "Whatever you intend to do," he said, voice low and edged with quiet menace, "you'd be wise to reconsider." The figure stiffened, then turned. For a moment they were both still, caught in the breathless silence of the night. Then the attacker lunged. Cashin moved without hesitation, sidestepping the blade as it sliced through the air. He caught the assailant's wrist, twisting sharply until the knife clattered to the ground. They lashed out with their free hand, striking blindly. But Cashin was faster. He drove his knee into their ribs, sending them stumbling back with a muffled grunt. The would-be killer recovered quickly, spinning on their heel and vanishing into the night before Cashin could give chase. He let them go, because right now, there was only one thing that mattered: Elise. He turned toward the house, his heart a steady drum in his chest. And for the first time in years, he climbed the familiar stone wall, reaching her window with the same ease as he once had, when they were young and foolish and untouched by the cruelty of the world. He knocked once, twice soft but insistent. There was a long pause. Then the window creaked open, and there she was, Elise Laurent, the woman who had broken him, the woman he had never stopped loving. Her dark eyes widened in shock, lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Because in that moment, Cashin knew she had never truly stopped loving him either. Elise stared at him as if she were seeing a ghost. Perhaps in a way she was. The last time she had looked upon Cashin Dane, he had been a man betrayed, a man consumed by the weight of her choices. And now, here he was, standing at her window like he had done long ago, only this time. There was something darker in his gaze, something carved out by years of silence and loss. The past rushed between them, unspoken but heavy, pressing into the narrow space that separated their bodies. "Elise," he murmured, his voice rough with something unreadable. Her fingers tightened against the windowsill. "Why are you here?" Cashin exhaled a slow breath, his jaw tightening. "There was someone outside," he said. "They were trying to get in." A flicker of something passed through her eyes, fear, or perhaps recognition. She masked it quickly, but Cashin had known her once, had memorized every shift in her expression, every lie she had ever told. She was afraid. Elise glanced toward the dimly lit streets below. "Did you see their face?" "No," Cashin admitted. "That they carried a knife. And they knew where to find you." She hesitated, her grip on the window frame unsteady. "You shouldn't be here, Cashin." Something sharp twisted in his chest at the way she said his name soft, like a memory. "And yet, I am," he said quietly. "Let me in." A war waged behind her eyes. He could see it, feel it, the part of her that wanted to send him away, to close the window and pretend this wasn't happening. but also the part that still knew him, that still remembered the nights they had spent whispering secrets in the dark, the love they had shared before everything had shattered. At last she stepped aside. Cashin climbed through the window, landing silently on the thick rug of her bedroom. The air inside smelled faintly of lavender and old parchment, a scent that had not changed since the last time he had been here. She shut the window behind him, drawing the curtains closed, as if she could lock the world away. "I don't need your help," she said, turning to face him. Cashin studied her, taking in the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers curled against the fabric of her nightgown. "Then tell me who's after you," he said. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "No one." His eyes narrowed. "Don't lie to me, Elise." She let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "That's rich, coming from you." Cashin felt the sting of her words, a sharp reminder of the night everything had fallen apart. He had once believed in her with every fibre of his being, and then she had betrayed him. Or at least, that was the story he had told himself. "I saw the way you reacted," he said, ignoring the old ache in his chest. "You weren't surprised to hear someone was watching you. You expected it." She turned away, pacing to the small writing desk in the corner of the room. A single candle burned there, its golden glow casting shifting shadows along the walls. "You shouldn't have come," she said again, her voice quieter this time. Cashin crossed the room, closing the distance between them. He could feel the heat of her presence, the weight of unspoken words pressing between them. "I had to." A long silence stretched between them. At last Elise sighed, her fingers tracing the edge of an open book on the desk. "I made a mistake, Cashin," she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. "A mistake that cannot be undone." Cashin watched her carefully. "What did you do?" She hesitated before speaking. "I thought I could outplay them," she said. "I thought I was clever enough to win." Something cold settled in his stomach. "Elise," he said, his voice dark with warning, "who did you cross?" She lifted her gaze to meet his, and for the first time, he saw it, the quiet terror lurking beneath her carefully composed mask. "The Aurelian Circle." Cashin stilled. The name was not one spoken lightly in Velmorn. The Aurelian Circle was a hidden power within the city, a society of the ruthless and the ambitious, where loyalty was bought in blood and broken oaths, were met with quiet disappearances. "You were a fool," Cashin said, his voice sharper than he intended. Elise let out a soft, bitter laugh. "Tell me something I don't know." He ran a hand through his dark hair, exhaling slowly. This was worse than he had thought. The circle did not forget. They did not forgive. If they were watching Elise, it meant they had already decided her fate. "Tell me everything," he said. "No more lies. No more half-truths." She hesitated, but then she did something Cashin had not expected. She reached for his hand. Her fingers curled around his, tentative, uncertain. 1,000 ghosts lived in that touch. 1,000 memories that had once meant everything. "I don't deserve your help," she said softly. Cashin looked down at their intertwined fingers, the years of distance between them crumbling in an instant. He could still walk away. He could leave her to her fate, let her deal with the mess she had created. But he already knew the truth. He would burn down the world before he let them take her. "Tell me what they want," he said. Elise swallowed hard. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she told him everything. And by the time she finished, Cashin knew one thing for certain. They were both already doomed. Cashin listened in silence as Elise spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, each word carrying the weight of something too dangerous to name aloud. "I thought I could outmaneuver them," she said, staring down at their joined hands, as if she wasn't entirely sure how they had ended up there. "I thought I could take what I needed and disappear before they noticed." Cashin's grip tightened. "What did you take?" Elise hesitated. Then, slowly, she pulled away from him, turning back to the desk. The flickering candlelight cast sharp shadows across her face, making her look older than he remembered, wearier. She opened a drawer with careful precision, withdrew a small velvet pouch, and placed it on the desk between them. Cashin stared at it for a long moment before reaching out. The fabric was soft beneath his fingers, but there was a weight to it, something solid, something valuable. He loosened the drawstrings and tipped the contents into his palm. A single ring, heavy and ornate, glinted in the dim light. The gold was inlaid with intricate patterns, and at its center sat a dark ruby, so deep in color it almost appeared black. Cashin inhaled sharply. "Elise," he murmured, his fingers closing around the ring. "Please tell me this isn't what I think it is." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Cashin had seen this ring before. Not in person, but in whispered stories. In the careful warnings of those who understood the true undercurrents of Velmorn. It belonged to the Aurelian Circle. More than that, it was a seal, a mark of power. Whoever wore this ring was not merely a member of the Circle. They were one of its architects. "Elise," Cashin said again, his voice lower, edged with something dangerous. "How did you get this?" She let out a breath, leaning against the desk as if her body could no longer bear the weight of the truth. "I took it," she said simply. "From Laurent d'Orsay." Cashin froze. Laurent d'Orsay. A name spoken only in hushed tones. A name that carried power in the streets of Velmorn. He was not merely a wealthy man. He was the architect of secrets, the silent hand behind the Circle's most delicate dealings. To steal from him was not an act of defiance. It was a death sentence. Cashin's mind spun, piecing together the implications. He's still alive. For now. Elise's fingers traced the edge of the desk, her voice steady but lacking the bravado he had once associated with her. "I thought I could use it to bargain, to carve a place for myself where no one could touch me." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "But they found out before I could even begin to use it. And now I am hunted." Cashin turned the ring over in his palm, its weight suddenly unbearable. "Why?" he asked. "Why take something so dangerous?" Elise finally looked at him, and in her gaze, he saw something he had not expected. Desperation. "Because I was running out of choices." Cashin exhaled slowly, trying to grasp the full scope of what she had done. Stealing from the Circle was one thing. Stealing their seal of power was another. "You should have left Velmorn," he said. "The moment you realized they knew." She smiled then, a ghost of the expression he had once known so well. "And go where? You know as well as I do that their reach extends beyond these walls." She wasn't wrong. The Aurelian Circle did not simply operate in Velmorn. Their influence stretched across cities, through trade routes and noble houses alike. If they wanted someone dead, there was nowhere in the world that person could run. Cashin set the ring down carefully, as if it might burn through the wood. "You don't have much time," he said. Elise nodded. "I know." He should have walked away. Even now, standing in her dimly lit room, knowing the dangers that awaited, he should have told her she was on her own. But he couldn't. Because despite everything, despite the years, the betrayals, the anger that still lingered in the corners of his heart, he could not let her die. And that meant only one thing. If the Aurelian Circle wanted her gone, Cashin would have to make himself a problem they couldn't ignore. Cashin listened in silence as Elise spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, each word carrying the weight of something too dangerous to name aloud. "I thought I could outmaneuver them," she said, staring down at their joined hands, as if she wasn't entirely sure how they had ended up there. "I thought I could take what I needed and disappear before they noticed." Castin's grip tightened. "What did you take?" Elise hesitated. Then, slowly, she pulled away from him, turning back to the desk. The flickering candlelight cast sharp shadows across her face, making her look older than he remembered, wearier. She opened a drawer with careful precision, withdrew a small velvet pouch, and placed it on the desk between them. Cashin stared at it for a long moment before reaching out. The fabric was soft beneath his fingers, but there was a weight to it, something solid, something valuable. He loosened the drawstrings and tipped the contents into his palm. A single ring, heavy and ornate, glinted in the dim light. The gold was inlaid with intricate patterns, and at its center sat a dark ruby, so deep in color it almost appeared black. Cashin inhaled sharply. "Elise," he murmured, his fingers closing around the ring. "Please tell me this isn't what I think it is." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Cashin had seen this ring before. Not in person, but in whispered stories. In the careful warnings of those who understood the true undercurrents of Velmorn. It belonged to the Aurelian Circle. More than that, it was a seal. A mark of power. Whoever wore this ring was not merely a member of the Circle. They were one of its architects. "Elise," Cashin said again, his voice lower, edged with something dangerous. "How did you get this?" She let out a breath, leaning against the desk as if her body could no longer bear the weight of the truth. "I took it," she said simply. "From Laurent d'Orsay." Cashin froze. Laurent d'Orsay. A name spoken only in hushed tones. A name that carried power in the streets of Velmorn. He was not merely a wealthy man. He was the architect of secrets, the silent hand behind the Circle's most delicate dealings. To steal from him was not an act of defiance. It was a death sentence. Castin's mind spun, piecing together the implications. He's still alive. For now. Elise's fingers traced the edge of the desk, her voice steady but lacking the bravado he had once associated with her. "I thought I could use it to bargain, to carve a place for myself where no one could touch me." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "But they found out before I could even begin to use it. And now I am hunted." Cashin turned the ring over in his palm, its weight suddenly unbearable. "Why?" he asked. "Why take something so dangerous?" Elise finally looked at him, and in her gaze, he saw something he had not expected. Desperation. "Because I was running out of choices." Cashin exhaled slowly, trying to grasp the full scope of what she had done. Stealing from the Circle was one thing. Stealing their seal of power was another. "You should have left Velmorn," he said. "The moment you realized they knew." She smiled then, a ghost of the expression he had once known so well. And go where? You know as well as I do that their reach extends beyond these walls. She wasn't wrong. The Aurelian Circle did not simply operate in Velmorn. Their influence stretched across cities, through trade routes and noble houses alike. If they wanted someone dead, there was nowhere in the world that person could run. Cashin set the ring down carefully, as if it might burn through the wood. You don't have much time, he said. Elise nodded. I know. He should have walked away. Even now, standing in her dimly lit room, knowing the dangers that awaited, he should have told her she was on her own. But he couldn't, because despite everything, despite the years, the betrayals, the anger that still lingered in the corners of his heart, he could not let her die. And that meant only one thing. If the Aurelian Circle wanted her gone, Cashin would have to make himself a problem they couldn't ignore. Cashin let the weight of the moment settle over him, the reality of Elise's situation twisting like a blade in his ribs. She had stolen the Aurelian Circle's ring, not for greed, not for vanity, but because she had been desperate. And now she would die for it, unless he did something. Cashin leaned against the desk, his fingers still curled around the edge of the ring. You said you wanted to use it to bargain. His voice was quiet, but there was a sharpness beneath it. What exactly were you trying to do? Elise hesitated, her gaze flickering away. Elise, she sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. There was someone, she admitted. Someone within the circle. I thought if I had leverage, if I had proof that I could expose them, they would let me go. Cashin's jaw tightened. Who? Elise shook her head. It doesn't matter. The plan failed before I could even get close. It matters, he countered. Because whoever you were trying to bargain with, they know. And if they know, that means they're either hunting you themselves, or they've sent others to do it for them. A silence stretched between them, thick with things unspoken. Then, quietly, she said, His name is Lord Alistair Vale. Cashin inhaled sharply. Alistair Vale was a name he recognized well. A nobleman on the surface, but in truth, one of the Circle's most ruthless enforcers. He was not a man known for mercy. Cashin stared at Elise, unable to hide the frustration creeping into his voice. You didn't just steal from the Circle. Elise, you tried to blackmail one of its most dangerous members. I know, she murmured, her arms wrapping around herself as if to ward off the cold. Cashin exhaled, running a hand through his dark hair. You have no allies in this. No one you can trust. She hesitated. Not anymore. He knew that tone. It was the sound of burned bridges, of mistakes that could not be undone, which meant she only had one person left. Him. Cashin stared at the ring on the desk, the deep red of the ruby catching the candlelight. For years, he had told himself he was done with her, that he owed her nothing. But as he looked into Elise's eyes, shadowed with exhaustion and fear, he knew the truth. He could not walk away, because love, true love, did not die. Even when it was buried beneath betrayal and heartbreak. Cashin straightened, slipping the ring into his pocket. We need to leave. Elise blinked. Now? Now, he confirmed. They already know where you are. If one of their men was outside tonight, there will be more by morning, and they won't stop until they have what they came for. For a moment she looked as though she might argue, but then she nodded. Cashin moved swiftly, crossing the room to the wardrobe. Take only what you need. Nothing that will slow us down. Elise hesitated before pulling open the small chest at the foot of her bed. She retrieved a leather satchel, slipping a few essentials inside: documents, coin, a dagger she tucked into the folds of her cloak. Cashin watched her, the sight of her preparing to run stirring something painful in him. This wasn't the Elise he had once known. The girl he had loved had been bold, unafraid. But this Elise? She was a woman who had learned that trust was a dangerous thing. Are you ready? He asked quietly. She looked at him, her dark eyes unreadable. No, she admitted. But let's go anyway. Cashin led her to the door, pausing to listen for movement beyond the walls. The house was silent. Too silent. He gestured for Elise to stay behind him as he eased the door open. The hallway stretched into darkness, only the faintest glow from the dying embers in the sitting room illuminating their path. Step by step they moved through the house, Cashin's senses alert for any sign of intrusion. The front door was their safest exit. He had scouted the street before entering, and he knew no one had been waiting there. But just as he reached for the latch, a shadow moved outside. Cashin froze. Elise tensed behind him, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly he pulled her back, pressing her into the shadows of the hallway. He drew a dagger from his belt, the cool weight of the steel grounding him. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Whoever was out there wasn't merely passing by. They were waiting. Watching. Cashin's mind worked quickly. The front door was no longer an option. That left only one escape route: the servants' passage leading to the garden wall. He turned to Elise, speaking in the barest whisper. We go through the back. She nodded, following him without hesitation. They moved swiftly through the corridors, the air thick with the scent of candle wax and old wood. Cashin's heart pounded, not with fear, but with the sharp focus of a man who had lived too long in the shadows. The servants' passage was narrow, lined with forgotten furniture and dust-covered crates. Cashin reached the end and pressed a hand against the wooden panel that led outside. Silence. Then he pushed. The door creaked open, revealing the garden bathed in silver moonlight. The wall stood just beyond, ivy-covered and slick from the night air. Cashin motioned for Elise to go first. She hesitated for only a fraction of a second, before gripping the vines and pulling herself up. He watched as she moved swift and sure-footed, the way she had always been. The moment her feet hit the other side, Cashin followed. His hands found the grooves in the stone, muscles straining as he pulled himself up and over. And then, a sharp whistle pierced the air. Cashin didn't think. He grabbed Elise's wrist and ran. They vanished into the darkness of the city, the shadows swallowing them whole. Behind them, voices rose, shouts of alarm, hurried footsteps. They had been seen, and now the hunt had begun. They ran. Elise's breath came in sharp bursts. Her heart beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The city stretched out before them, dark and endless, its narrow alleys twisting like veins through the heart of Velmorn. The shouts behind them grew distant, but Cashin didn't slow. Left, he murmured, barely audible over the pounding of their footsteps. She didn't question him. She turned sharply, slipping into the narrow space between two crumbling buildings. The alley was barely wide enough for them both, the damp walls closing in on either side. Cashin pressed her forward, his body tense as he listened. The streets were alive now. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. A door creaked open. The city had not yet woken, but the disturbance was enough to stir its restless heart. Cashin exhaled, his breath warm against the back of her neck. They'll spread out soon. We need to keep moving. Elise turned to face him, their bodies nearly flush in the tight space. Where are we going? Away from here. That's not an answer. Cassian's eyes flickered to the entrance of the alley, the moonlight cutting a silver line through the darkness. The docks. Elise stiffened. No. It's the best chance we have. She shook her head. We're not leaving the city. Elise. I can't run, Cashin. Her voice was sharp, edged with something that sounded too much like finality. If I disappear, they'll hunt me down anyway. They'll never stop. Cashin studied her, his jaw tightening. So what then? You stay and wait for them to slit your throat. Her gaze didn't waver. I have to end this. There it was. The part of her he had always known. The part that refused to be controlled, even when it meant facing certain death. Cashin cursed under his breath. How? She hesitated. Then, quietly, she said, I still have leverage. His stomach twisted. The ring. Elise nodded. It's more than just a symbol, Cashin. It's a key. The circle's wealth, their transactions, their secrets. It's all tied to this. Her fingers clenched at her side. If I can get to Alistair Vale before he gets to me, I might have a chance. Cashin exhaled slowly, his mind working through the implications. Alistair Vale was powerful. But if what Elise said was true, if this ring was more than just an emblem of rank, then he had something to lose. And in Velmorn, a man with something to lose was a man who could be bargained with. But it was a gamble, and Elise had already lost too much. Cashin reached into his pocket, pulling out the ring. The ruby caught the dim light, deep and endless, as if it held the very shadows of the city within it. You're certain about this? He asked. Elise met his gaze. I have to be. Cashin sighed. He had always known Elise to be reckless, but this was something else entirely. Still, she was right about one thing. Running would not save her. We can't do this alone, he muttered. Elise frowned. We don't have a choice. There's someone I know, Cashin said. Someone who can get us close to Vale without setting off alarms. Her eyes narrowed. Who? Cashin hesitated before answering. Renard Vale. Elise went still. You're serious? Cashin gave a humorless smile. Unfortunately, Renard Vale was not a man to be trusted. He was a smuggler, a broker of secrets, a man whose loyalty could be bought and sold 100 times over in a single night. But he had one thing Cashin needed: access. Elise ran a hand through her dark hair, frustration clear on her face. You think he'll help us? I think he'll help himself, Cashin corrected. And if helping us gets him something he wants, he'll do it. A long silence stretched between them. Then Elise sighed. Fine. Where is he? Cashin's smile didn't reach his eyes. Exactly where you'd expect. The gambling hall smelled of wine and sweat, its air thick with smoke and quiet murmurs of half-spoken deals. Cashin led Elise through the maze of tables, past noblemen cloaked in silk and criminals draped in stolen wealth. The underbelly of Velmorn was alive here, thrumming beneath the surface like a second heartbeat. Renard sat at a table in the back, a lazy smile on his face as he shuffled, a deck of worn playing cards between his fingers. When he saw Cashin, His grin widened. Well, well, he drawled. If it isn't the ghost of bad decisions past. Cashin pulled out a chair, settling into it with practiced ease. Elise remained standing. Reynard's gaze flicked to her, curiosity sparking in his dark eyes. And you've brought a friend? How charming. Elise didn't speak. Reynard tilted his head. Not in the mood for pleasantries, then? He smirked. That's a shame. Cashin leaned forward, his voice low. We need your help. Reynard's smile didn't falter, but there was something sharper beneath it now. My help comes at a cost, you know that. We're willing to pay. Reynard hummed, tapping a card against the table. That depends on what you're asking. Cashin pulled the ring from his pocket, setting it between them. For the first time, Reynard's expression changed. The lazy amusement drained from his face, replaced by something far more dangerous. Elise stole from the Aurelian circle, Cashin said evenly. And now, we need to get her in the same room as Alistair Vale. Reynard leaned back, considering them both with careful calculation. Then, after a long moment, he let out a quiet laugh. Oh, he murmured. This is going to be fun. The moment Reynard's laugh died away, Cashin's eyes narrowed. There was no humour in his tone, no trace of amusement. Reynard Vale was not a man who laughed unless he was calculating his next move. And Cashin knew from experience that when Reynard smiled like that, it was often a precursor to something far more dangerous. Elise and I are serious, Cashin said, his voice tight with restrained urgency. We don't have time for games. Reynard's gaze flickered to Elise, lingering for a moment on the cold defiance in her eyes before shifting back to Cashin. His fingers drummed idly on the table. Serious? My dear Cashin, you've always been serious, Reynard drawled. But you see, this is a tricky business. The Aurelian circle doesn't just hand over their enemies. And Vale, well, he's not someone you approach lightly. Cashin's fist tightened around the edge of his chair. We know the risks. We're prepared. Reynard studied him for a moment longer, then leaned back in his chair, his smile slowly widening. Prepared? Oh, I'm sure you are, but let's talk about the price. Elise didn't come here to haggle, Cashin said sharply. We're not offering you gold or favours, Reynard. We're offering you access to the very heart of the circle. This is your opportunity to finally do what you've been whispering about for years. Reynard's eyes narrowed. And what exactly is that, Cashin? You think I haven't heard the rumours? Stop playing games. If we can get close to Vale, we can finally expose him. You can finally stop lurking in the shadows and take a seat at the table of power. Reynard's smirk faltered for just a moment, and Cashin saw the flicker of something in his eyes: ambition, hunger, the same drive that had pushed him to broker secrets for the highest bidder. Expose Vale, huh? Reynard said quietly. That's a tempting offer. But you don't understand what you're asking, Cashin. Vale is not just a man. He's a system. His power doesn't end with the circle it extends into every corner of Velmorn and beyond. Every trade, every shipment, every noble house. All of it is connected to him in ways that would break you both if you tried to tear it down. Elisa's voice was low but clear. We're not asking you to tear it down. Just help us get to him and we'll handle the rest. Reynard turned his gaze on her, his eyes appraising. And what makes you think you're the right people for that job? After all, the circle's not exactly fond of your past. I didn't come here to beg, Elise shot back, her posture stiffening. If you can't help us, we'll find another way. Cashin glanced at her, the unspoken tension between them palpable. But he could see that Elise was determined. She wasn't the type to back down when the stakes were high. And even though he had serious doubts about Reynard, he knew they had no other choice. Reynard sighed, leaning forward with an exaggerated display of impatience. All right. I'll help you. But you'd better understand something before we proceed." He paused for effect, then continued in a low, almost conspiratorial tone. "The Aurelian Circles game is won. You can't win with just a few tricks up your sleeve. You'll need more than the ring. And some clever words. If you want to make it out of this alive." Cashin gave a grim nod. "We know, but we don't have time to waste. We need a plan." Reynard looked between them, his gaze lingering on the ring that still sat in the center of the table, as though it held all the answers. Finally, he stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "There's one man in this city who can get you to Vale without raising alarms. He's got the connections and the influence, but he's also a ghost, moving in and out of places where even the circle can't follow. His name's Matthias Harrow." Elise's brow furrowed. "And how do we find him?" "Simple, you don't. He finds you." Reynard grinned. "But I can point you in the right direction. You'll need to meet him at the docks, of course. It's where he likes to operate." Cashin exchanged a glance with Elise, the weight of Reynard's words sinking in. The docks were the last place they should be so many eyes. So many dangers, but if Matthias Harrow was the key to reaching Vale, they had no choice. Cashin stood, sliding the ring back into his pocket. "When?" Reynard smiled, his eyes gleaming with something too sharp to be friendly. "Tonight, midnight. Don't be late." Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Cashin and Elise standing at the table. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Elise spoke. "Do you trust him?" Cashin didn't hesitate. "No, but right now, we don't have a choice." Elise's expression darkened, but she didn't argue. "Then let's go." Midnight came too quickly. Cashin and Elise made their way through the winding streets of Velmorn, the city alive with the muted hum of late-night activity. A few street vendors lingered in the shadows, their carts filled with goods no one needed. The occasional figure passed by, hooded and silent, but no one paid them any attention. They reached the docks just as the moon rose higher in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the water. The docks were deserted, save for a few ships anchored in the harbour, their sails stilled by the calm night air. Cashin's eyes scanned the shadows, alert to every sound. Then he saw him. A tall man stepped from the shadows, his face partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. His movements were deliberate, as though he had been watching them for far longer than they had been watching him. Cashin's hand instinctively moved to the dagger at his side, but the man held up a hand, signalling peace. "You're late," Matthias Harrow said in a voice that was low and gravelly, the kind of voice that carried weight. "But that's not surprising." Cashin stepped forward, keeping a watchful eye on the man. "Reynard sent us." Matthias's lips curled into a smirk. "Of course he did. The question is why?" "We need your help," Elise cut in, her voice sharp. "Get us close to Alistair Vale, that's all we need." Matthias's eyes narrowed, studying her closely. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and began to walk toward one of the smaller ships. Cashin exchanged a glance with Elise before following. Matthias didn't speak as they walked, leading them down a narrow path between the moored ships. The air was thick with the smell of salt and rotting wood, the sound of water lapping against the hulls echoing in the stillness. When they reached a small boat at the end of the pier, Matthias gestured for them to climb aboard. "You're taking us out to sea?" Elise asked, her voice tinged with skepticism. "No," Matthias replied, his face unreadable. "But I have something to show you." As they boarded the boat, Cashin couldn't shake the feeling that they were already in too deep. But with each passing moment, he knew they were closer to whatever fate had in store for them. And there was no turning back. The boat rocked gently as Matthias guided them into the murky waters of Velmorn's harbour. The wooden planks creaked underfoot, the low hum of the oars in the water their only company. Elise sat at the edge, her eyes scanning the horizon, her thoughts far away. Cashin could see the quiet determination etched on her face, the weight of their journey pressing down on her. The ring, hidden safely in her pocket, was still a constant reminder of the dangerous game they were playing. A game where one wrong move could cost them everything. "So, where exactly are we going?" Cashin asked, his voice cutting through the silence. Matthias didn't answer immediately. He rode in silence, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. There was something about his stillness that unsettled. Cashin like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. After a long pause, Matthias spoke, his voice rough but calm. "You'll understand soon enough." Cashin exchanged a glance with Elise, both of them uneasy, but neither of them willing to show weakness. They had to trust Matthias for now. The boat glided further into the harbour, past the larger ships anchored along the piers, into a more secluded area of the docks where the water grew darker and the lights from the city seemed distant, muted. As they neared a small, weathered warehouse nestled at the edge of the docks, Matthias slowed the boat and dropped the oars. "We're here," he said simply. Cashin could see nothing particularly remarkable about the place. It was just another rundown building, its windows boarded up and its doors reinforced with thick iron bars. But Matthias's presence here, in this forgotten corner of Velmorn, suggested there was more to it than met the eye. "Stay close," Matthias instructed as he stepped out of the boat onto the dock, his movements precise and fluid, like someone who had navigated these waters 1,000 times. Cashin and Elise followed, their steps echoing on the wooden planks. Matthias led them toward the warehouse, stopping before a large, rusted door. Without a word, he knocked 3 times in quick succession, a series of sharp raps that seemed to resonate with an unspoken code. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing a narrow, dimly lit hallway inside. Matthias stepped through without hesitation, motioning for them to follow. "Come on," he muttered, his voice low, as though he feared being overheard. They entered the hallway, and the air immediately felt heavier, the scent of damp wood and stale air pressing against them. The sound of their footsteps was swallowed up by the thick walls, and the silence felt oppressive. Matthias led them deeper into the warehouse, where the faintest hint of light began to filter through cracks in the walls. They turned a corner, and the space opened up into a large, hidden room, an underground cavern of sorts. At the center of the room, there was a large table made of rough-hewn wood, piled high with papers, maps, and crates. The walls were lined with shelves filled with crates and barrels, and the smell of salt water lingered in the air. It was a place used for deals, exchanges, and whispers of power The kind of place where secrets were bought and sold. This is where it all happens, Matthias said, his voice softer now, almost reverent. The circle's transactions, their smuggling routes, their money, it's all routed through here. If you want to get to Vale, you'll have to go through the right channels. Cashin looked around the room, his mind racing. So this is where we get our access? Matthias nodded, his eyes glinting in the low light. This is where everything starts. I don't know how deep you're willing to go, but if you want to make it out of this alive, you'll have to play the game by their rules. Elise crossed her arms, her gaze piercing. And you're offering us what? Exactly. You've already got the ring, Matthias said with a small smile, his gaze flicking to Elise. That's a start. But Vale won't care about some trinket unless it gets him something he wants. If you really want to get his attention, you need leverage. And I can give you that. Cashin raised an eyebrow. Leverage? Matthias reached into one of the crates behind him and pulled out a bundle wrapped in dark cloth. With a fluid motion, he unwrapped it, revealing a series of blackened documents. These, Matthias said, are the contracts, the ones that bind the Circle's deals to the city's highest-ranking officials. You can't touch Vale without understanding the people who work for him. These documents, if you can get them into the right hands, will unravel the very foundation he's built. Cashin's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the leverage they needed. The moment they had been waiting for. But Elise wasn't convinced. How do we know these are real? She asked, her voice skeptical. Matthias gave a knowing smile. Trust me, they're real. They wouldn't be here if they weren't. Elise glanced at Cashin, her expression unreadable. He could see the wheels turning in her mind. She was calculating the risk, the potential fallout, and weighing whether this was their best chance. After a moment, she nodded. All right, we'll take them. Matthias raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. Good. But remember, he said as he handed over the documents, getting these into the right hands isn't enough. You'll need to make Vale believe you have something more than just a pile of papers. You'll need to make him see that you can ruin him. Cashin's gaze was hard. We'll make him believe. Matthias studied them both for a long moment before speaking again, his voice quieter now. There's one more thing. Getting to Vale will be the easy part. But once you're in the same room with him, you'll need to be ready for anything. He's not the kind of man who lets people walk away. What do you mean? Elise asked, her voice tense. Matthias stepped closer, his eyes dark. Vale's always 2 steps ahead of everyone. If he thinks you're a threat, he won't hesitate to eliminate you. You'll be pawns in a game much bigger than you can imagine. And when you're dealing with men like Vale, you can't afford to make mistakes. Cashin's jaw clenched. He had known that this would never be easy. But hearing Matthias's warning brought the full weight of their situation, crashing down on him. Understood, he said, his voice steady, though the tension in his gut told him just how dangerous the road ahead was. Matthias nodded, then turned toward the door. I'll get you a meeting with someone who can arrange your introduction to Vale. But after that, it's up to you. Cashin and Elise exchanged one last glance before following Matthias out of the room, their minds heavy with the knowledge that everything was about to change. The boat ride back to the main docks was even quieter than before. The water had become choppy as the wind picked up, the waves slapping against the sides of the small boat. Cashin kept his gaze fixed ahead, the documents in his pocket feeling heavier with every passing moment. The weight of what they were about to do was starting to settle in. And with it came the realization that they were on the edge of something far more dangerous than they had initially thought. Elise sat at the opposite end of the boat, her arms crossed, her face a mask of quiet determination. She wasn't one for idle conversation, and Cashin appreciated that right now. They needed to focus, to plan. The pieces were finally falling into place, but the road ahead was still fraught with danger. Matthias had given them the leverage they needed, but there was a steep cost to getting close to Vale, and they both knew it. Matthias, having steered them back to shore, didn't speak as he helped them out of the boat. He was a man of few words, but his silence spoke volumes. "Don't waste time," Matthias said, his eyes dark. "The longer you wait, the more likely it is that Vale will know you're coming. And trust me, if he catches wind of you trying to undermine him, he won't hesitate to take you down. Make your move quickly, or it's over." Cashin nodded, pulling the collar of his coat tighter around his neck. The streets of Velmorn were quieter now, the city's pulse slowing as the night wore on. But even in this dim hour, Cashin could feel the weight of the city's secrets pressing down on him. Vale's influence was everywhere, in every corner, every shadow. "We'll take care of it," Elise said, her voice calm but resolute. She turned to Cashin, her eyes steady. "We'll get to him." Cashin didn't doubt her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. Vale wasn't just a man, he was the embodiment of power, corruption, and control. The idea that they could just waltz into his domain and force him into submission seemed too simple, too naive. There had to be more to it, and the closer they got, the more uncertain Cashin became. But it was too late to turn back now. "Be careful," Matthias warned as they parted ways. "If you get in over your heads, don't say I didn't warn you." With that, Matthias disappeared into the night, leaving Cashin and Elise alone to navigate the last leg of their dangerous journey. The sun had barely risen by the time they made their way to the meeting place, an abandoned estate on the outskirts of the city. It was the perfect location for a clandestine meeting, isolated, hidden behind a wall of thick trees and vines, with no witnesses to whatever might unfold. Cassian's heart beat in his chest as they approached the heavy iron gates, the atmosphere thick with tension. "This is it," Elise said, her voice low. "Are you ready for this?" Cassian looked at her, feeling a deep surge of pride and fear. "Ready as we'll ever be." As they approached the gate, a figure emerged from the shadows, his silhouette outlined against the dimming sky. The man was tall, wearing a dark cloak that masked his features. "Elise." The man's voice came, a smooth whisper, as though he had been waiting for them all along. "Cashin." He nodded in their direction, his voice carrying a subtle authority. "You've come." Cashin tensed. The stranger's voice was too calm, too knowing. There was something unsettling about the way he spoke, as though he had expected them all along, as though he had already seen their fate unfold. "Elise," he said again, his eyes locking with hers. "You have the ring, don't you?" She hesitated for just a moment before producing the ornate ring, the dark metal catching the last rays of sunlight. "Good," the man said. "But remember, the ring alone won't do. You must show Vale you have something more, something valuable. The documents Matthias gave you," he added, turning to Cashin. "They're your bargaining chip." Cashin's throat tightened. The way this man spoke made it sound like they were already deep in the game. They had come for Vale's power, but the more they moved toward him, the more Cashin realized that they were only pawns in a much larger scheme. How do we use them? Cashin asked, his voice tight with impatience. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied them both, his eyes lingering on Cashin's face as if weighing his very soul. You don't use them, not directly, the man said finally, his voice colder now. You show them. Let Vale see that you hold the key to his undoing. But beware if you think for one moment that he will let you walk away after this. You are gravely mistaken. Elise stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. We're prepared for whatever comes. The man gave a sharp, humorless laugh. You think so? This is not some simple game of power. You are dealing with men who have controlled this city for years. Their reach extends far beyond what you can imagine. Even with those documents, you are still at their mercy. Cashin glanced at Elise, his jaw tightening. He had no illusions about what they were up against. But the idea of simply giving up was out of the question. They couldn't back down now. Not when they were so close. We'll take our chances, he said firmly, locking eyes with the mysterious man. The stranger gave a low, almost imperceptible nod, as if satisfied by Cashin's resolve. Very well, he said, stepping aside to reveal the entrance to the estate. Enter. But remember, the price for crossing Vale is steep, and you won't know until it's too late. Inside the estate, the air felt different, darker, thicker with the scent of secrets and long-forgotten power. The walls seemed to close in around them as they made their way through the grand hall, each step echoing on the cold marble floor. At the far end of the hall, a set of double doors loomed, ominous and heavy. Cashin could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, each footstep drawing him closer to the confrontation with Vale. He could almost hear the low hum of power, the pulse of the circle, the silent hand of fate pulling them into its grip. There was no turning back. As they reached the doors, the stranger stopped them with a hand on the shoulder. This is where you must go alone, he said. Only one of you may enter. Cashin felt the heat of fear in his chest, but Elise stepped forward without hesitation. I'll go, she said. This is my fight. No, Cashin said, his voice tight. We're in this together. But Elise was already shaking her head. No, Cashin. This has always been mine. You have your own role to play. Trust me. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their breathing, the air thick with the weight of their choices. Finally, Cashin stepped back, nodding, even though every instinct in him screamed to stay at her side. I'll wait for you, he said. She nodded once, and with that, Elise stepped forward, pushing the heavy doors open. The doors creaked open with a heavy, drawn-out sound, revealing a vast chamber beyond. The air was cooler here, as if the room itself was untouched by time, shielded from the rest of the world. In the center of the space, an ornate fireplace burned low, casting flickering shadows against the tall, marble columns that lined the room. Every surface was immaculate, polished to perfection. The cold grandeur of the place was oppressive, a testament to Vale's unyielding control. Elise stepped forward, her boots silent on the polished floor. Her eyes scanned the room, the tension in her chest coiling tighter with each step. Somewhere in the shadows, she knew Vale was watching. She could feel his presence, like a weight pressing against her skin, an invisible force that watched from every angle. As she walked deeper into the room, The door slammed shut behind her with a finality that made her jump. A soft chuckle echoed through the darkness, like a whisper of wind in an empty hall. "Welcome." Vale's voice came from the shadows. It was smooth, like silk over a blade, full of assurance and malice. "I've been expecting you." Elisa's heart beat in her throat, but she didn't flinch. She stood tall, refusing to show weakness. "I've come to speak with you," she said, her voice steady despite the storm swirling inside her. There was a pause, a long, pregnant silence, before Vale emerged from the darkness. His figure was tall and imposing, draped in a cloak of deep, midnight blue that seemed to swallow the light. His eyes, a piercing silver, gleamed with an unnerving intelligence. He smiled almost too warmly, his expression one of quiet amusement. "I know why you're here," he said, his voice low and predatory. "That you're mistaken if you think you can threaten me with trinkets and papers. You're playing a dangerous game, Elise." Her fingers brushed the ring hidden beneath her coat, the one Matthias had given her, and she stood her ground. "I'm not here to threaten you," she replied. "I'm here to make you an offer." Vale took a step closer, his boots clicking softly on the floor. "An offer?" His smile widened, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who had seen too. Many people try to outmaneuver him and fail. "You're a bold one, I'll give you that. But you're out of your depth." Elisa's hand tightened around the documents hidden within her coat. She had come this far. She couldn't afford to falter now. "What if I told you that I had something far more valuable than just a ring?" she asked, her voice cool. Vale's eyes flicked to her, intrigued, though he didn't show it entirely. "And what might that be?" Without a word, Elise pulled out the documents, the ones that Matthias had entrusted to them. She held them in front of her, allowing Vale to see them. But she didn't offer them just yet. The power, the leverage was in the presentation. Vale's gaze lingered on the papers for a moment, his lips curling into a thin line. For a brief moment, his mask of confidence cracked, just enough to show a flicker of concern. He took a step forward, his voice quieter now. "Where did you get these?" "I'm not here to play games with you, Vale," Elise said, her eyes narrowing. "These contracts bind you, don't they? They tie you to the highest echelons of power in Velmorn. They can ruin you." Vale's expression remained unreadable, but his hand twitched ever so slightly at his side. "You think that just because you have a few pieces of paper, that you can undo everything I've built? You think I don't have contingencies?" Elise didn't flinch. She had anticipated his arrogance, his belief that he could twist any situation to his advantage, that she wasn't backing down. "I know how you operate," she said, her tone sharp, cutting through the tension in the air. "You're not invincible, Vale. People like you always think they can control everything. But the truth is, there's always someone you don't see coming. Someone who knows your secrets." Vale's eyes darkened, a subtle shift in his posture that made Elisa's blood run cold. "You think you're the first to threaten me with these games?" His voice grew colder, more dangerous. "You think I haven't seen this play before? How many others have tried, just like you, and failed?" "I'm not like the others," she retorted, her voice steady despite the chill creeping into her bones. Vale let out a soft laugh, the sound low and dark. "No, you're not, but you're still playing by the same rules." He took another step closer, his gaze piercing. "You think you have leverage, But I control the pieces here. Elise, you're nothing more than a pawn in a game you don't even understand. The words stung, but Elise refused to let them take root. She had come too far, sacrificed too much to turn back now. This wasn't just about the documents, it was about showing Vale that there were consequences for his actions, that he wasn't untouchable. This game isn't over yet, she said, her voice cold. I'm not asking you for anything. I'm showing you what I can take from you. Vale's expression remained unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, now something calculating, something dangerous. He studied her for a long moment, as though considering his next move. You think you're in control, but you're not, he said, his voice low. You don't understand the forces you're dealing with. You've already lost. Elise's heart raced. His words were laced with venom, but they didn't deter her. She had to press on. There was no turning back. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, holding the documents out in front of her. Maybe, she said, her voice unwavering, but I'm willing to take that risk. Vale stared at the papers for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as he took them from her. He scanned the contents quickly, his face betraying little emotion. Then, without a word, he tossed them aside, the papers fluttering to the ground. You're playing with fire, Elise, Vale said, his voice dangerous now. And fire burns everything in its path. Elise's breath hitched in her chest. The confrontation she had feared was upon her, and Vale was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. What do you want from me? She demanded. Vale's smile returned, but it was cold, calculating. I don't want anything from you. You're just a fleeting annoyance in a much larger game. But you will learn your place soon enough. Before she could react, Vale stepped back, his gaze lingering on her one last time. You've done well to come this far, but you won't make it out of this room. Elise's pulse quickened. She had to make her move, and fast. But Vale had already begun to turn away, his figure retreating into the shadows once more. I'll make sure of that, he whispered over his shoulder. Elise's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't move a muscle. Vale's cryptic words lingered in the air, thick with menace, as if they were both a warning and a promise. She knew that this confrontation could end in only one of two ways: with Vale's continued grip on the city, or with her own demise. But she refused to show fear. Vale had turned his back to her, his cold demeanor making her skin crawl. She had to act. She had to use whatever leverage she had left before he decided it was too late. The silence stretched on, a room heavy with the weight of unspoken threats. Elise reached for the ring again, her fingers brushing against the cool metal. The weight of it was a reminder this was her only card to play, her only chance to break Vale's hold on Velmorn. Before she could make a move, the door behind her opened with a soft creak, and a figure stepped into the room. Elise's breath caught in her throat as she turned to face the newcomer. It was Cassian. He looked as tense as she felt, his eyes scanning the room quickly as they locked onto Vale, who hadn't noticed his presence yet. Cassian's sudden appearance sent a jolt of panic through her, and for a split second, Elise was certain Vale would react violently. But Vale remained still, as if he had expected this, his face betraying no emotion. Cassian's gaze met Elise's, and for a fleeting moment, she saw the worry in his eyes. He understood what was at stake, but he didn't hesitate. He walked toward her, steady and calm, his hand reaching for hers. "Elise," he whispered, his voice laced with urgency. "We can't stay here. He's more dangerous than we realized." Elise didn't pull away. She held his hand tight, the only reassurance she had in the storm of uncertainty. She had to stay focused. "I'm not leaving without a fight," she replied quietly, her voice laced with a newfound resolve. "This ends now, one way or another." Vale turned his head just slightly, a faint smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "Ah, so the boy has come to play the hero." His voice oozed with disdain. "Do you think you can stop me, Cashin? You've always been a pawn in a much bigger game." Cashin's eyes flashed with anger, but he held his ground. "You may control the city, Vale," he said coldly, "but you don't control me." Vale's expression hardened, the amusement fading from his face. "You don't understand the rules, boy. You never did. And now you'll learn the consequences." With a sharp motion, Vale raised his hand, and suddenly the room seemed to darken, the temperature dropping as if something unseen was tightening around them. Elise's heart raced as she tried to focus, tried to think of what to do next. Vale was playing with them, his manipulation creeping into every corner of the room. Cashin stepped forward, his eyes narrowed. "If you think you can intimidate us, Vale, you're wrong." His voice was steady, but there was a fire behind it that Elise hadn't heard before. "We're not backing down." Vale's smile returned, colder than before. "Very well," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "If you want to play this game, then we'll see who comes out on top." He gestured with a flick of his wrist, and the air seemed to pulse with an unseen force. Elise's skin prickled as if every nerve was alive with warning. Something was happening, something they couldn't understand yet. Without warning, the room exploded into motion. Vale's influence filled the air, a force so powerful that the ground beneath them seemed to tremble. Castin's grip on Elise's hand tightened, but he couldn't shield her from the wave of energy that rolled over them. It was as though the very walls were closing in, forcing them to confront the reality of Vale's power. "Elise!" Cashin's voice was sharp with panic as he pulled her toward him, trying to shield her from whatever Vale had unleashed. Vale stood in the center of the chaos, unaffected, his eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction. "You've made your choice," he said softly, "and now you will pay the price." In that moment, Elise understood. Vale had always been more than just a man. He was an embodiment of the city's darkness, its hidden underbelly. He controlled everything: the power, the money, the lives. Nothing happened in Velmorn without his approval, and those who challenged him were either broken or disappeared. She couldn't let him win. Not now. Not after everything they had sacrificed. "Cashin, listen to me," Elise said urgently, her voice rising above the storm that was swirling around them. "We need to expose him. The documents." "I know," Cashin interrupted, his voice hoarse. He was looking around, his eyes darting, calculating. "But we need to get out of here, Elise. We're not ready to face him like this. He'll destroy us. We can't run," Elise said, her voice firm. "We've come too far. We're not leaving without making him pay." For a moment, the world seemed to pause, the air thick with tension. Then, Vale's voice broke through, cold and cutting. "You're both fools," he said, his eyes narrowing as he watched them, sizing them up like prey. "You think you can expose me, bring down everything I've built. You don't understand. There's no one left who can stop me. His words were a final, crushing blow, but Elise didn't falter. She stepped forward, pushing past the fear that had been gnawing at her insides. She held her ground, refusing to let Vale intimidate her any longer. "You're wrong," she said, her voice unwavering. "There is one thing you didn't count on. People like you only win because they convince everyone they're invincible. But you're not. You're just a man. And we're going to expose everything you've done." Vale's eyes flashed, his lips curling into a tight, contemptuous smile. "You don't understand. You can't win. I am Valmorn." "Not anymore," Cashin snapped, his voice full of defiance. "This ends now." The room seemed to contract around them, the air crackling with danger. But Elise knew that this was their moment. They were standing on the edge of something vast and dangerous, and she could feel the weight of it bearing down on her. She had to act now. With a sharp, decisive motion, Elise reached into her coat and pulled out the documents once more. "This is your undoing," she said, holding them high in the air, daring him to take the bait. Vale's eyes flickered to the documents, then back to her. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with anticipation. For a moment, it seemed as though the world itself was holding its breath. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, Vale's hand reached out to take them. The stakes are rising, and the moment of confrontation is nearing. Would you like to continue with how the documents alter the balance of power? Or dive deeper into the shifting dynamics of Vale's influence? Elise's breath caught in her throat as she held the documents high, feeling the weight of Vale's gaze upon them. The room had never felt so tense, as if the very air itself was charged with the gravity of the moment. For a fleeting second, she wondered if she had miscalculated, if Vale had already seen through her plan. But the flicker of doubt vanished as quickly as it appeared. Vale's hand, pale and precise, stretched out toward the papers. Elise tightened her grip, refusing to hand them over too easily. It was a game now, a battle of wills, a challenge to his dominance. "You think this will change anything?" Vale's voice was low, almost a growl, his confidence never wavering. But the tension in his posture suggested otherwise. He was calculating, weighing the risk. His eyes didn't leave the documents as they hovered between them. "These papers mean nothing. I am untouchable. No one can challenge me, not even you." "Maybe," Elise said, her voice cold, steely. "But these contracts are the key to your downfall. You can't control everything, Vale. Not anymore." For a moment, Vale stood still, the words hanging in the air between them like an unspoken threat. His lips curled into a smile, though there was no warmth in it, only the chill of someone who had been in control for far too long and was unwilling to let go. "Do you really believe that?" he asked, his voice soft now, dangerous in its calm. "You may think you have something to bargain with, but in the end, you're just a fleeting inconvenience." Elise's heart raced. The tension between them was unbearable, each second stretching into eternity. She couldn't let him take those papers without seeing the consequences. If she had to force his hand, she would. She had come this far, there was no turning back now. "I'm not leaving here without making you face the consequences," Elise said, her words steady but laden with a weight she had never known before. Cashin, who had been silent until now, stepped closer to her. His presence was a shield, though the storm around them was far from over. He understood what was at stake, and the way his eyes met hers gave her strength. They were in this together. Vale's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. But that brief crack was enough to make Elisa's heart race with the hope that she had reached him, that his confidence wasn't as unshakable as he wanted to believe. You think you have power, don't you? Vale's voice was now icy, a sneer pulling at the corners of his mouth. These papers, your threats, they mean nothing. They're just words. In the end, power is not about threats. It's about who holds the strings, and I am the one who pulls them. Elise felt the words hit her, but they didn't have the effect Vale had hoped for. Her gaze didn't waver. You're wrong, she said softly, almost whispering, as though she had already known the truth all along. You can't control everything, Vale, not anymore. At her words, the room seemed to shift, as if the foundation of his world was beginning to crack. She watched him closely, noting the flicker of something uncertain in his eyes. For a moment he hesitated. The hesitation was all she needed. She shoved the papers toward him with a force that was almost defiant. And this time, Vale didn't retreat. His fingers brushed the edge of the contract, and Elise felt a surge of power rush through her. This was it. This was the moment when everything could change. But just as Vale reached for the documents, the air in the room shifted again. A sharp, sudden coldness filled the space, making Elise shiver involuntarily. The darkness seemed to press in, the walls themselves narrowing as if to trap them. Enough! Vale's voice was a low command, and with a single gesture, the atmosphere in the room became unbearable. Elise felt her breath catch in her throat as an invisible force slammed into her chest, pushing her back with a strength that left her gasping for air. The room spun. She tried to move, but her body was frozen, the world around her darkening. Vale stepped forward, his figure looming over her, the cold power radiating from him more palpable than ever. You think you can defy me, he said, his voice soft and venomous. But you forget one thing. Elisa's heart pounded in her ears as she fought against the pressure closing in around her. You're nothing but a pawn in my game. Vale continued, his eyes cold, his expression unreadable. And you will learn that I always win. Castian's voice cut through the air, frantic. Elise, no. In that instant, something inside Elise snapped. The pressure in her chest was unbearable, but she refused to crumble under it. She wasn't powerless, not anymore. She was no one's pawn. She took a deep, shuddering breath and forced herself to stand tall. With every ounce of willpower she had left, she broke free from the invisible grasp that held her. No, she said, her voice stronger now, sharper than before. You've underestimated me. With a sudden movement, Elise wrenched the papers from her coat and thrust them toward Vale again. But this time, it wasn't the contract she was offering. The real power, the real leverage was in the truth. Vale's eyes flicked to the papers, but it was too late. The realization hit him like a slap. The documents weren't the endgame. They were the means to an end, a key to unlocking everything he had tried to hide. I'm not here for your control, Elise said, her voice unwavering, her eyes locked onto his. I'm here to expose you, to show the world what you really are. Vale's face twisted in disbelief, but Elise saw something deeper in his eyes. Fear. A brief, fleeting glimpse of something he had long tried to suppress. You don't understand, he said, his voice suddenly tight with the weight of something darker than anger. You can't expose me. There's no one left to stop me. Elise didn't flinch. That's where you're wrong. You've built your empire on lies, Vale, and I'm the one who will bring it down. The room seemed to hold its breath as Vale took a step back, his eyes never leaving hers. For a long, tense moment, neither of them moved. Then, with an almost imperceptible movement, Vale's hand dropped to his side, his shoulders slumping just enough for Elise to see the shift. This was the beginning of his unraveling. The battle was far from over, but Elise had struck the first blow. She knew that she had to press on, to expose Vale's lies, corruption, and his stranglehold on Velmorn. There was no turning back. I'll make sure of that, Elise said softly, the promise heavy with resolve. And in the depths of that promise, a new light flickered. The shadow that Vale had cast over the city might have seemed uncheckable, but now there was a crack. The darkness was beginning to retreat. Elise stood her ground, her eyes never leaving Vale as the room seemed to pulse with the weight of her words. She could feel the shift, the very air had changed. Vale's confidence, once uncheckable, was beginning to crack under the pressure. She had made him doubt himself, even if only for a moment, and that was all she needed. Vale's expression hardened, but there was a flicker of uncertainty buried beneath the facade. His gaze darted to the papers in her hands, then back to her face, and for the first time, Elise saw something other than cold calculation in his eyes. Fear. Just a glimmer. But it was there. You think you can just waltz in and tear everything I've built down? Vale sneered, his voice icy once again. You think these documents will do anything? You're nothing. You and your little plans. You've already lost. But Elise didn't falter. Cashin stood beside her, his presence like a silent promise of solidarity, a reminder that they were in this together. The storm of uncertainty that had nearly drowned her moments ago had passed, replaced by the steely calm of someone who had nothing left to lose. Don't be so sure of yourself, Elise said, her voice a quiet but firm declaration. You've built your empire on fear, Vale, and fear isn't enough anymore. You've underestimated everyone around you, and you've forgotten what it feels like to lose control. Vale's lips curled into a smile, but it was a thin, dangerous thing, like a serpent preparing to strike. You talk as though you know something I don't, he said, his voice now dripping with mockery. Tell me, Elise, what is it you think you can do that hasn't been tried already? People like you don't get to challenge people like me. Elise took a step forward, refusing to back down. People like me, she echoed, her eyes narrowing. People who understand the value of truth. People who see through the lies you've been feeding this city. You think you've got everything in the palm of your hand. But I'm not afraid of you. Vale's eyes flashed dangerously, but he made no move. Instead, his expression darkened, his tone turning colder than before. You think your little truth can stand up to me? You think it will matter when I've already sealed every escape route? There is nothing you can do to stop me now, Elise. He took a step toward her, his presence commanding. The air seemed to thicken, and Elise's heart quickened, but she didn't budge. She had come too far to let him win. But as Vale advanced, a low, rumbling noise filled the room, an ominous sound, almost like the earth itself was shaking. Elise's breath hitched. It was coming from the walls, the floor, the very foundation of the building. And then it clicked. Vale wasn't just manipulating people. He had bound the city itself to his will, using power that went beyond the physical. He controlled everything. The walls, the streets, the very pulse of Velmorn. Cashin must have realized it too, for he moved closer to her, his expression filled with a mixture of awe and fear. "This is it," he murmured. "He's not just powerful, he's tapped into something ancient. This city, it's his, literally." Elise's mind raced. The realization hit her like a blow. Vale had used the city's old power, its history, its darkest corners to make himself invincible. It wasn't just political power he had claimed. He had intertwined himself with Velmorn's very existence. She looked up at Vale, her heart still pounding, but now with a new determination. This was what she had to break. Not just his schemes, but the very connection he had to the city itself. "You may control Velmorn," Elise said, her voice rising with new purpose. "But you don't control me. You don't control everyone." Vale's expression shifted, but he didn't respond. He only stood there, his stance widening, as though he was preparing for some final confrontation. The air crackled between them, and Elise could almost taste the tension. The silence stretched out like a taut wire, and she knew, deep down, that this was the final moment. She glanced at Cashin, who nodded, his eyes steady. They had no more tricks to play. This was it. And somehow, despite the fear gnawing at her gut, she felt more certain than she had ever been in her life. Vale's smile twisted once more. "You think you have the strength to defeat me? You really believe that?" Elise took a slow, deliberate step forward. "Yes, I do." And then, something unexpected happened. The room, which had felt like it was closing in on them, suddenly seemed to expand, the air clearing as if the walls had taken a step back. The oppressive weight that Vale had exuded began to lift, and Elise could sense a shift, not just in the room, but in the city itself. She didn't know how it happened. Maybe it was the documents, the truth they contained. Maybe it was her sheer willpower, refusing to let him win. Or maybe, just maybe, Vale had underestimated something more powerful than even his dark magic, the will of those he sought to control. "You think I'm afraid?" Vale spat, but his voice was now laced with something less confident, less assured. "No," Elise said, shaking her head. "But you will be." For the first time, Vale's composure faltered. A flicker of doubt crossed his face, just enough to make him pause. It was that moment of weakness, that split second where his grip on the city's power slipped, that gave Elise the opening she needed. Without warning, she threw the documents toward him, not as a physical weapon, but as the last shred of his undoing. The truth, the contracts, everything he had buried, hidden, manipulated, all laid bare. Vale's eyes shot to the papers in midair, and for just a moment, Elise saw the shift in his expression. It was a brief flash of panic, followed by an almost imperceptible frown. But it was enough. The room seemed to crack, and then everything happened in a rush. Vale's voice rose in fury, but it was too late. The power that had once radiated from him, so strong, so consuming, began to wane. The walls trembled. The shadows in the corners of the room recoiled. The very heart of Velmorn, tied so tightly to Vale's essence, seemed to rebel. Elise felt a surge of triumph finally. They were breaking through. The city was starting to awaken, to fight back against the force that had held it captive for so long. The balance of power was shifting, and Vale's empire was crumbling, piece by piece. "No!" Vale howled, his voice a guttural roar as the city itself seemed to turn against him. Cassian's hand was steady on her shoulder, grounding her as the storm raged. Together they watched as Vale's power unraveled. And in that moment, Elise realized that the true strength had never been in the walls or the magic. He controlled it had always been in the people, who refused to be silenced. She wasn't just fighting for herself or Cassian. She was fighting for the city, for every person who had suffered under Vale's rule. It was over. The air seemed to vibrate with the crumbling of Vale's power as the room around them shifted. The once imposing walls, now shuddering under the weight of the city's rebellion, began to crack and groan as though even they were unwilling to carry the burden of Vale's rule any longer. Elise stood tall, her heart pounding with the rhythm of victory. But she knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Vale, his expression twisted with rage and disbelief, reached out as though to grasp the power he had lost. His fingers barely brushed the air, but nothing happened. His connection to the city was severing, fraying at the edges. The suffocating grip he had over Valmorn was slipping away, piece by piece, as though the very ground beneath him was rejecting him. "You don't get to leave this city standing," Vale spat, his eyes burning with fury. The transformation in him was staggering. Gone was the calm, controlled ruler. In his place stood a man desperate, out of control, someone who had finally realized he wasn't as invincible as he thought. Elise stepped forward, her eyes never leaving his. "This city belongs to the people," she said, her voice unwavering, though the battle still raged within her. "You've used them, manipulated them, but they're not yours to control anymore." Vale let out a bitter laugh. "You think you've won? You're nothing but a pawn in a game far bigger than you." But Elise knew better. She wasn't a pawn. She never had been. She was the key, the catalyst that had set this process in motion, and she wouldn't let him drag her into his twisted game again. With a swift motion, she turned to Cassian. "We have to go," she said quietly, though the weight of the moment pressed on them both. Without waiting for a reply, Elise walked toward the door, her pace slow but deliberate. Vale's scream followed them, raw and furious, echoing off the walls, but it was growing weaker with each passing second. The power that had defined him for so long was dwindling, unable to withstand the backlash of his own hubris. As they stepped out into the hallway, the very ground beneath their feet seemed to shift. The once familiar corridors of Vale's stronghold felt alien now, almost hostile. The echoes of Vale's rule, once so ingrained into the stone and wood of the fortress, were unraveling, leaving an emptiness behind. Cassian's hand found hers, steadying her as they moved toward the exit. "We did it," he said softly, the relief in his voice undeniable. Elise nodded, but her thoughts were already racing. "Not yet. We've won the battle, but there's still so much to fix. The people need to see what he truly was. They need to know the truth." Cassian squeezed her hand, understanding the weight of her words. "They will. We'll make sure of it." The outside world greeted them with the cold air of early morning, the sun barely beginning to rise over the horizon. It was a new day, and yet Elise knew that the city's wounds would not heal overnight. The people had suffered under Vale's rule for far too long, and the scars ran deep. But there was hope now, something that had been absent for far too long. As they made their way toward the heart of Valmorn, Elise couldn't help but feel the weight of the future pressing down on her. She had torn down one empire, but the rebuilding would be just as difficult, if not more so. The people would need leadership. They would need someone they could trust to guide them. Someone who understood the darkness that had consumed them and was capable of leading them into the light. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," Elise admitted quietly as they walked through the quiet streets. The city still mostly asleep. Cashin glanced at her, his expression softening. "You don't have to be ready," he said. "You've already shown more strength than anyone else could have. You did what needed to be done, Elise, and we'll do it together." Her heart swelled with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. Could she really lead? Could she really fix what had been broken? "Together," she echoed, the words settling in her chest like a promise. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Elise felt a flicker of hope for the future. She had taken down a man who had seemed untouchable, a man who had bent the very city to his will, and in doing so, she had proven that nothing was impossible, not if you had the courage to fight for what was right. As they approached the city centre, the first signs of life began to stir. People were waking up, going about their morning routines. The streets, once bustling with the oppressive presence of veils and forces, now felt free, empty of the fear that had once held them in a chokehold. Elise's heart beat faster as she turned to Cashin. "We need to gather everyone. The truth needs to be told. Valmorn deserves to know what they've been living under." He nodded. "We'll make it happen." But as they neared the city square, something unexpected caught Elise's eye. A crowd had gathered, whispers filling the air. It wasn't just a handful of people, it was hundreds, maybe more. And they weren't waiting for a leader. They were waiting for something else. As Elise stepped forward, the crowd fell silent. Their eyes were filled with curiosity, hope, and strangely enough, expectation. "What's going on?" Elise asked, her voice uncertain. Cashin's eyes scanned the crowd, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. Then, as if on cue, someone stepped forward from the crowd. It was a woman, tall and regal, with a look of quiet strength in her eyes. Elise recognized her immediately. It was Margot, the one person in the city who had been an ally to her from the very beginning. The one person who had always believed in the possibility of change. "Elise," Margot called out, her voice clear and commanding. "We've been waiting for you." The crowd shifted and Elise felt a knot form in her stomach. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice thick with uncertainty. Margot stepped forward, a calm smile on her face. "The city is ready. The people are ready. You've done what needed to be done, Elise. But now we need someone to lead us. Someone who knows the truth and can guide us through this." Elise blinked, shocked by the weight of Margot's words. I don't know if I can. I've never." "You're exactly what Valmorn needs," Margot said, her gaze unyielding. "You've already shown us the way. Now, it's time to lead us forward." Elise looked out over the crowd, their faces expectant, hopeful. They weren't looking at her with fear. They were looking at her with trust. They had seen what she had done. They had seen her fight for them, and they were ready to follow. Elise's chest tightened, the enormity of it all settling over her. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She wasn't even fighting for Cashin, though he had been her constant strength. She was fighting for the people of Valmorn, for the future, for the chance to rebuild something better than what had been destroyed. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility press down on her shoulders. But she didn't shrink from it. This was her moment. This was what she had been fighting for all along. "I'll lead you," she said, her voice firm, steady. "But we will do this together. We will rebuild this city, piece by piece. We'll undo the damage done, and we will create something better." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices rising together, stronger than any empire Vale had ever built. And for the first time, Elise felt the weight of hope settle in her heart, a light burning brighter than she ever thought possible. The shadowed past was behind them. The future had begun. The days bled into weeks, and the weight of responsibility did not lessen. In the early morning hours, as the first light of day bathed the streets of Valmorn, Elise would find herself wandering the quiet pathways of the city, taking in the progress that was slowly unfolding. The scars left by Vale's rule were everywhere: the crumbled buildings, the overgrown alleys, the lingering tension in the air, but there was also something new. Hope. Hope that had been absent for so long, but now blossomed in every corner of the city, like flowers pushing through the cracks of old stone. The people had responded to the call for rebuilding, not just physically, but emotionally. There was an undeniable sense of unity that permeated the streets now. The marketplace, once under the watchful eyes of Vale's enforcers, was now a place of laughter and trade, where vendors exchanged goods not under the threat of violence, but in the spirit of shared prosperity. Children played in the open spaces, their laughter a sound that had been rare in the past, a reminder of what had been lost, but also of what could be regained. But it wasn't easy. There were setbacks. There were days when the old structures of power tried to reassert themselves, when remnants of Vale's supporters whispered in the shadows, attempting to sow discord. Elise knew she had to stay vigilant. The wounds of the past were still raw, and some people would never accept the new order. But for every whispered threat, there were 100 voices rising in unison. Voices that were no longer afraid to speak out, to stand up for what was right. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the streets began to cool, Elise and Cashin walked side by side through the city square. They had spent the entire day meeting with council leaders, discussing policies that would ensure justice for those who had suffered under Vale's reign, and outlining a new direction for Valmorn. "How do you feel about the progress?" Cashin asked, his voice soft but carrying the weight of his concern. Elise glanced around at the bustling square, the faint glimmer of torchlight reflecting in the windows of nearby buildings. "I think we're getting there. Slowly, but there's still so much to be done. So much we need to heal." Cashin nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Healing isn't something that happens overnight, but it's happening. You've shown them that they don't have to live in fear anymore. You've shown them that they can build something different." "I hope so," Elise murmured, her gaze drawn to a group of young people laughing, as they set up a small stage in the center of the square. It was becoming a tradition: open-air performances, where artists could express themselves freely, no longer hiding in the shadows of a totalitarian rule. It was a small thing, but it felt like a declaration of freedom. "I just wonder how long it will take for them to truly believe in it, to believe in themselves again." "It'll take time," Cashin said, "but it's worth the wait. They're strong, Elise. You've given them the strength to stand tall again." Elise smiled faintly, though the weight of the future never truly left her. They had won the battle, yes, but the war for the hearts and minds of the people was ongoing, and she couldn't afford to lose focus now. As they walked toward the council hall, Margot stepped into view. her posture always composed, but her eyes reflecting the same tiredness Elise had felt over the last few weeks. The responsibility of leadership was a heavy burden on both of them. "Elise," Margot called, her voice steady. "There's something you need to see." Without waiting for a response, Margot turned and led them down a side street, her strides purposeful. The mood shifted instantly. What had been a peaceful evening now felt charged with an underlying tension. "What's happened?" Elise asked, her brow furrowed. "A group of former soldiers, Vale's old enforcers, have been spotted near the city's edge," Margot explained, her voice low. "They're rallying together, trying to stir up unrest. I don't think they're planning an attack, but we can't afford to take chances." Elise's pulse quickened, the familiar sensation of fear creeping back into her chest. Despite everything, despite how far they had come, there would always be those who resisted change, who clung to the old ways because they couldn't bear to let go of power. "Where are they now?" Cashin asked, his hand instinctively moving to his sword hilt. "They're gathering in the old warehouse district," Margot said. "I want to show you where they are, but we need to be discreet. If they sense we're coming, they might scatter." "Lead the way," Elise said, her voice firm. "We'll handle this together." The three of them moved swiftly, staying to the shadows, moving with purpose through the city's winding streets. The warehouse district was on the outskirts of Velmorn, a place where the city's once thriving industry had long since withered. Now, it was filled with abandoned buildings, overgrown vines, and the lingering scent of decay. As they neared the area, Elise could hear the low murmur of voices. She motioned for Margot and Cashin to stay behind as she moved closer, ducking behind an old stone wall. Through the cracked windows of one of the warehouses, she could make out a group of men soldiers. By the look of them standing in a circle, speaking in hushed tones. "They're plotting something," Elise whispered, her gaze narrowing. "That they're not ready to fight yet. They're still trying to figure out what their next move is." "What do we do?" Cashin asked, his voice tight with caution. "We let them make the first move," Elise said, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to creep in. "We give them a chance to choose. But if they decide to act, we'll be ready." They waited in silence, the minutes stretching long as the voices inside the warehouse grew louder. Elise's thoughts raced. The threat was real, but it wasn't the only one. Even if they could neutralize this group of former enforcers, there would be more. There would always be more. Vale's influence might be gone, but the systems he built, the fears he instilled, would not vanish so easily. The shadows of his empire would continue to haunt Velmorn, and Elise knew that she would have to remain vigilant. It was not just the battle for physical control that mattered, it was the battle for the city's soul. Margot shifted beside her, her eyes scanning the area. "They'll try to rally the city's outliers," she said quietly. "There are still people who believe in the old ways. They're just waiting for a reason to rise again. I'll make sure they don't get that chance," Elise said, the fire in her chest igniting once more. "We'll deal with this tonight. But this is just one part of a larger fight. A fight for the future." The words hung in the air, heavy and full of truth. The future of Velmorn was not yet written, but Elise knew she would be the one to write it. One step at a time, one decision at a time. With the people by her side, with Cashin and Margot at her back, she would ensure that the shadows of the past would never again find a place to thrive. As the night stretched on, the quiet of the city before dawn seemed to hold its breath. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, Elise felt ready to face whatever came next. She had broken the chains of the past, and now she would forge a new path forward, one that would ensure the freedom of Velmorn for generations to come. The night air felt thick with anticipation as Elise, Cashin, and Margot watched from the shadows of the warehouse district. The former enforcers had begun to grow restless, pacing in tight circles. Elise's instincts told her that they were waiting for the right moment to strike, to seize the chaos that had spread throughout the city. She couldn't allow that. The battle for Velmorn's future would not be fought in secret. Meetings or in the dark, corners of forgotten warehouses. It had to be fought openly, by the people, and for the people. If these men chose to make a stand against that vision, Elise would stand firm. They're too disorganized to make an immediate move. Margot observed in a low voice, watching the men through a crack in the wall. They're divided, some of them look like they're still trying to hold on to the old ways. Others seem unsure. They're not a united front. That's good, Elise said, her gaze narrowing. It means they're weak, and weakness is something we can exploit.